Welcome to NarrativeNook audio tales where enchanted stories come to life. If you enjoy our stories, please subscribe, like and share to support our channel. Enjoy listening.
Although Archie didn't exhibit obvious symptoms, Roxanne still poured a cup of medicine for him. Archie took the cup and looked at her worriedly. "Aren't you going to drink some, Mommy?" "I remember Mommy had some water from my cup as well." After hearing Archie's words, Lucian stared at the woman in front of him with a darkened gaze. He only knew the children had consumed the contaminated water, but he had just found out that Roxanne had consumed it, too. Moreover, she was pretending as if she didn't do so. "I just had a sip, so I'm fine." Roxanne comforted Archie with a smile. Archie glanced at his mother worriedly again before looking at Lucian. "Mommy might not listen to me, but she might listen to Daddy." Upon meeting Archie's gaze, Lucian said in a deep voice, "You should drink some medicine, just in case." While speaking, he picked up a new paper cup from the side and handed it to Roxanne. Having no other choice, Roxanne accepted the cup and poured the remaining traditional medicine into the cup. After downing the medicine in one go, she carefully fed the medicine to Benny, who was being held in her arms. Benny was still slightly conscious and knew that Roxanne was feeding him some medicine. Cooperatively, he drank the medicine sip by sip. As soon as Benny drank the hot medicine, a warm feeling rose in his stomach, suppressing the pain he was experiencing just now. Soon, his expression became relaxed. After feeding Benny some medicine, Roxanne asked with concern, "So how are you feeling right now?" Benny grinned obediently. "Thank you, Mommy. I feel so much better now." Roxanne heaved a sigh of relief before turning around to look at Estella, who was in Lucian's arms. Estella still had her eyes closed and seemed to be in a weak state while Lucian was feeding her the medicine carefully. However, Lucian obviously didn't know how to take care of the child, and most of the medicine was spilled. As for the remaining medicine, it was being spat out by Estella instinctively, as it was too bitter. Seeing how uncooperative Estella was, Lucian knitted his brows tightly. He felt anxious and sorry at the same time. Let me do it instead." Roxanne could no longer stand by and watch. Hence, she reached out to take the cup from his hand. Lucian lifted his head and glanced at her. In the end, he said nothing and merely handed her the cup. Compared to him, Roxanne's movements were way gentler, and she slowly fed Estella the medicine. This time, although Estella would still spit out some medicine, she still consumed a fair amount of it. Regardless, it was way better than when Lucian was feeding her. After Estella had finished the medicine, she gradually woke up. As soon as she opened her eyes, she saw Roxanne's worried face and called out softly, "Miss Jarvis." Upon hearing Estella's cute voice, Roxanne finally felt a sense of relief. At the same time, she teared up uncontrollably. It was fortunate that Lucian delivered the medicine to them on time. If not, the children might have suffered even more. How are you feeling?" Lucian asked in a low voice. Since Estella was still in a daze, she thought she was dreaming when she heard Lucian's voice. When she raised her eyes and saw him, she stared at him in confusion before saying, "Daddy?" A rare tender expression appeared on Lucian's face as he responded with a deep hum. Feeling puzzled, Estella tilted her head. "Why are you here?" "I remember Daddy telling us he wouldn't come here with us." Lucian patted her head gently and replied, "Archie told me you guys are sick, so I'm here to deliver some medicine to you." After hearing Lucian's explanation, Estella finally understood the situation and responded with an obedient nod. "Did you have fun today?" Lucian stopped asking about her sickness and began talking about the camping trip in an attempt to divert her attention. As expected, the mention of the camping trip diverted Estella's attention instantly. "I had tons of fun." Then, she curled up her fingers one by one, counting the events that happened that day, as if she was worried that her father wouldn't believe her simple remark. "Miss Jarvis gifted me a lovely flower wreath, and we had a delicious barbecue. Also, Benny and Archie gifted me some beautiful pebbles." It seemed like Estella had encountered endless joyful events that day. After recalling all the happy occasions she had experienced that day, her stomachache didn't seem to be so serious anymore. Lucian's expression softened as he listened to Estella recount her experiences throughout the day. Roxanne did a body checkup on the children again. She had done some research on this bacterium before. Therefore, the traditional medicine she made was the right treatment for the sickness, and the effect of the medicine was immediate. After checking the children over and confirming that they had been cured, Roxanne finally felt a sense of relief. She turned around and looked at the man next to her. It's late. Let's go back now." Lucian nodded casually. Just when he was about to get up, Archie spoke sweetly while staring at the adults with anticipation. Mommy, can we not go home so soon? We haven't stayed overnight in the tent yet." With that, he tugged on the corner of Roxanne's clothing with one hand and pointed at the night sky with another. "Look. The sky is so beautiful tonight." Upon facing her son's hopeful gaze, Roxanne hesitated for a split second before becoming adamant again. No, we can't stay here. Benny and Essie just recovered from their illness, so they must go home and rest. I'll bring you here again next time." Roxanne didn't want to stay, not only because the children had just recovered from their sickness, but also because she didn't want to face Lucian for an entire night. Upon being rejected by Roxanne, Archie looked disappointed. He then turned around and shot Benny and Estella a look. Benny and Estella instantly understood Archie's signal. With a pitiful look, Estella tugged at Lucian's expensive shirt. "Daddy, I'm so tired." Meanwhile, Benny frowned and pressed his palm on his stomach. Mommy, I think my stomach still aches a little." The children had always been good at acting. Moreover, after all the incidents that happened that day, Roxanne naturally wouldn't overthink their remarks. Roxanne wavered upon hearing that Benny's stomach was still aching. Benny has been sick for the entire afternoon. Now that he's finally feeling better, it won't be worth it if we travel on the bumpy mountain road and make him ill again. Bearing that thought in mind, she gave up on her initial decision and changed her mind. If that's the case, we shall rest here for the night." Upon gaining her agreement, the children shifted their gazes to Lucian at the side. Naturally, Lucian prioritized the children's health and agreed to the suggestion nonchalantly. Then, the two adults settled the three children in the tent. Looking at the space that had just been emptied, a hint of hesitation appeared on Roxanne's face. Besides the tent, there seemed to be no other areas suitable for resting. Yet, when she imagined Lucian sleeping next to her and the children, she felt slightly weirded out by the thought. That will make us look like an actual family. While she was contemplating what to do, Lucian's deep voice sounded beside her ears. You should get some rest. I'll go sleep in the car." With that, he got up and left the tent. Archie, Benny, and Estella stared at Lucian's retreating back before exchanging a look. All three of them felt exceedingly reluctant to see him leave. "We plotted and schemed to have them agree to stay the night here so that an opportunity for them to spend time together could be created. But if Daddy were to leave for real now, our efforts would have been in vain. Besides, he's tall, and the car is cramped, so it'd be an utter torment for him to sleep in the car." Their brains whirred at warp speed as they tried to come up with an idea that would have Lucian change his mind. At the same time, Roxanne's eyes flickered as she watched the man's figure fade into the distance. Let's just squeeze a little and make do with the space." Ultimately, she couldn't help saying that when he had almost disappeared from her line of sight. The instant her words rang out, Lucian halted in his tracks and glanced back over his shoulder. Roxanne dipped her eyes. "You can't stretch your limbs out in the car, so you'll definitely end up horribly sore after spending a night there. There's room in the tent anyway, and it's far more comfortable than the car. If you don't mind, Mr. Farwell, we can just make do for a night." Although she didn't want to face him, she knew he would undoubtedly suffer if he were to sleep in the car, considering his height. On top of that, she was at fault for the situation then. He merely came over to help, and it made no sense for her to deprive him of having a good night's sleep. Never had it crossed the children's mind that she would take the initiative and ask him to stay. They were stunned for a few seconds before they hastily seconded Roxanne. "I want to sleep with you, Daddy," Estella whined, stretching her arms out at Lucian. Likewise, Archie and Benny urged in juvenile voices, "You sleep with us, Mr. Farwell. We're a bit scared." Lucian's gaze swept over the few of them, only to stop on Roxanne's face in the end. In all honesty, he hadn't expected her to propose that he stay either. When Roxanne sensed his gaze, her eyelashes quivered. She raised her eyes and flashed him an airy smile to convey her sincerity. Seeing that she hadn't made that offer out of courtesy, Lucian frowned slightly. He spun around and walked into the tent, plopping down on the other side of the children. At his return, a glimmer of craftiness glinted in the children's eyes. Soon, Roxanne's gentle voice drifted into their ears. It's late, so hurry up and sleep." Upon hearing that, the children closed their eyes in contentment. A while later, Estella opened her eyes and cast her gaze in Roxanne's direction pitifully. I can't sleep. Will you tell me a story, Miss Jarvis?" At that moment, Roxanne was lying on her side next to the children, waiting for them to doze off before she did so herself. Thus, she agreed to Estella's request without any hesitation and started narrating a fairy tale softly. In that instant, it was utterly silent in the tent, with only her melodic voice drifting into the air. A small night light was turned on in the tent, but the lighting was dim. Sitting on the other side of the tent, Lucian enigmatically fixated his eyes on the children in front of him and the woman telling them a story under the subdued lighting. The children were adorable and well-behaved, whereas Roxanne's voice was gentle and warm. Anyone who witnessed such a scene would unequivocally find it incredibly heartwarming, Lucian included. As the story drew to an end, his gaze visibly turned tender. An indeterminate time passed before the three children slowly fell asleep. Listening to the sound of their even breathing, Roxanne carefully lay down. Alas, sleep didn't come even after a long while had passed. Despite the children acting as a barrier between her and Lucian, she still couldn't ignore the man's presence. In fact, regret crept into her. Ugh, I shouldn't have asked him to stay when he wanted to leave earlier. After Archie, Benny, and Estella had dozed off, Roxanne turned off the small night light in the tent. Consequently, the tent was pitch dark right then, and she had no idea whether Lucian was asleep on the other side. "Well, I didn't hear any movement in a long time, so he has probably gone to sleep." At that thought, Roxanne quietly got up and left the tent. She sat outside under the moonlight alone and stared blankly into space. The weather had been great for the past 2 days. The moon shone brightly, but there weren't many stars in the sky. For safety reasons, Lucian had the headlights turned on, illuminating the tent's surroundings and rendering it like daylight. As Roxanne looked at the scenery around her, her mind gradually began drifting. Too many things had happened that day. At first, the children suddenly contracted a bacterial infection. Then, she inexplicably ended up in the same space as Lucian. Both of the incidents had her emotions turn into a jumbled mess. While she was distracted, movement abruptly sounded behind her. Jumping in fright, she reflexively jerked her head back. Her entire body was tense, and she was ready to defend herself anytime. When she made out the person behind her, she gradually relaxed her guard. "What are you thinking about out here instead of sleeping at this hour?" Lucian stepped out of the tent and regarded the woman before him with a frown. In truth, the same could be said of him. Earlier, he unexpectedly heard rustling sounds that signaled someone leaving from the other side of the tent and thought that Roxanne would be back shortly. To his surprise, he didn't hear any movement after waiting for some time. Worried, he came out to check on her. Little did he expect that he would be greeted by the sight of her sitting under the moonlight and zoning out no sooner had he left the tent. Roxanne was dumbfounded for several seconds. She left the tent precisely because she wanted to avoid him, so that question left her at a loss for words. I can't answer him candidly and say I only came out because I couldn't sleep due to his presence in the tent, can I? During the time when she wavered over how she should respond to that, Lucian had already sat down beside her. Roxanne stiffened imperceptibly, but she promptly forced herself to relax. I was wondering where the bacteria in the kid's water came from. A brief moment later, she nonchalantly gave the man a reasonable answer. Indeed, that was also one of the reasons that contributed to her quandary. Lucian arched his brows a fraction, a hint of solemnity entering his eyes. Perhaps the water accidentally got contaminated by some plant or the like. There are a lot of bacteria in the wild in the first place. However, Roxanne shook her head in negation. That's impossible. I'm familiar with that kind of bacteria. It doesn't exist naturally and is created artificially. Generally, it's only used in labs and would never appear in the wild. Following her comment, Lucian's gaze darkened. You mean to say that? It goes without question that it's a deliberate act of sabotage. Otherwise, such a bacteria would never appear in the wild and even happen to fall into our water, Roxanne asserted firmly. Initially, she merely wanted to find an excuse for her evasion, but she inevitably turned somber when speaking of the bacterial infection. Even an adult wouldn't be able to withstand the symptoms from such a bacterium, much less two kids. If it weren't for you delivering the medicine over in time, I don't know how much longer Benny and Essie could have held out. The scene of Benny and Estella in the throes of agony flashed across her mind, and her eyes blazed with fury. Who exactly was ruthless enough to have done such a cruel thing to a few kids? Understanding of the entire incident dawned upon Lucian. His face went as black as thunder, and his voice turned icy. If that's really the case, Farwell Group will ferret out the culprit who added the bacteria, even if it meant turning over every stone in the world. Roxanne wasn't at all surprised by Lucian's statement. After all, the culprit who added the bacteria into the children's water put Estella through great agony. Considering her importance to the man, it was only natural that he was determined to punish the culprit. Are you still not planning on changing your mind despite the incident this time? Lucian queried out of the blue, making little sense. Roxanne's thoughts were still on the culprit who added the bacteria, so she was somewhat perplexed when she heard that question. Without bothering to wait for her reply, Lucian added, Benny instinctively called out for his father while in a semi-conscious state. If I remember correctly, the same thing happened previously. Back then, they were all infected by the bacteria on Estella. Archie and Benny first itched all over before running a high fever. When Benny was semi-conscious, he also asked for his father in a mutter. At the mention of that matter, Roxanne's heart clenched. Biting the bullet, she countered, he has been lacking fatherly love for a long time now, so that's nothing out of the ordinary. Despite knowing that Benny was merely talking in his sleep, she still couldn't help feeling guilty. She instinctually thought that the man only put that question to her all of a sudden because he discovered her secret. But then, the next words out of his mouth caught her completely off guard. That's precisely why I'm talking about this. You can also see how much they yearn for fatherly love, yet you still plan to continue depriving them of it. While saying that, Lucian stared at her meaningfully. Without needing him to spell it out further, Roxanne instantly caught his drift. In other words, he was telling her in a roundabout way that he was willing to be Archie and Benny's father, thus seeking her opinion on the matter. He had asked a similar question countless times, but she was still panicked as usual. Her eyes alighted on the man beside her briefly before she hurriedly averted her gaze. I'm not the only one with the final say in this matter. I'll respect their opinions. After saying that, Roxanne got to her feet in feigned calmness. I'm a tad sleepy, so I'm going in to rest first. Not even daring to turn back, she went back into the tent to avoid the man behind her once more. Meanwhile, Lucian studied her retreating back, his gaze dark and unfathomable. Naturally, he could tell that she was avoiding him. In fact, He could already imagine that she would react in such a manner when he voiced that utterance just now. Nonetheless, he was still inexorably frustrated to personally witness her evasion of him. Verily, he didn't know how much longer such a cat-and-mouse relationship between them could last. In the tent, Roxanne gingerly returned to her spot earlier. Before lying down, she meticulously checked on the children. Only when she had ascertained that she didn't awaken them did she lie down with peace of mind. As she listened to their even breathing, turmoil brewed within her. Needless to say, she wasn't sleepy at all. Even as she lay in the tent then, she didn't feel a hint of drowsiness. She simply didn't know how to face that question by Lucian and made an excuse at random, ending up back in the tent to avoid him. Before, she left the tent to avoid him. Yet, she went back in right then for the same reason. Thinking of that, she couldn't help finding her actions hilarious. On second thought, Lucian has probably figured out why I went in and out of the tent. I wonder what he's thinking right now. At the possibility that he might enter the tent again, her heart lodged in her throat. Surprisingly, there was no movement from outside, even after she had waited for an indeterminate time. Drowsiness finally hit her, and she groggily fell asleep. By the time Roxanne woke up, the sun was already high in the sky. As soon as she opened her eyes, she saw Archie, Benny, and Estella eyeballing her earnestly in a file. Mommy, Miss Jarvis." Seeing that she had awakened, the children greeted her in unison and threw themselves at her while giggling away. At the sight of the three soothing countenances, Roxanne's heart melted in a flash. She reached out and stroked their heads before slowly sitting up. Since she had just awoken, she was still a tad disorientated. She couldn't shake off the feeling that she had seemingly forgotten something. Be that as it may, the three children in front of her gave her no time to ponder upon that. How are you guys feeling?" Roxanne scrutinized them in concern. Last night, she thought they would have recovered after ingesting the medicine. Unexpectedly, Benny still felt unwell. That was the only reason she agreed to let them stay overnight. "I wonder how much they have recovered now." At her question, Benny flashed her a guilty smile. I'm fine now. I'm feeling much better after a good night's sleep." Still worried, Roxanne checked the children over again and ascertained that there were no problems before dropping the matter. Just when she let go of their hands, Estella's stomach started growling all of a sudden. It wasn't until then that she remembered that they hadn't eaten much when they took ill last night. "But I never expected us to spend the night here and neglected to prepare sufficient food. There's still food left from yesterday, but it isn't fresh anymore. On top of that, I don't dare to feed them anything I brought after the incident last night." Following that line of thought, she got up without hesitation. Let's go back." While saying that, she took the lead and walked out of the tent. No sooner had Roxanne stepped out than she caught sight of the Bentley, whose headlights were already turned off, a stone's throw away. In a flash, memories of the events that transpired last night flooded her mind. It belatedly occurred to her that she had no idea where Lucian had gone. At the thought of the man, she inevitably recalled the question from him before she went to sleep last night. For a moment, her mind turned chaotic once again. By the time she snapped back to reality, Lucian was already standing before her, checking on the children's condition with his head lowered. Daddy, where did you go?" Estella regarded her father with curiosity etched across her features. When she saw no signs of him upon waking up early in the morning, she thought he had already gone back. Patting her on the head, Lucian started in a deep voice, "I've got something to discuss with Ms. Jarvis. Go and play in the tent for a while with Archie and Benny." He didn't ask about their condition. Roxanne might be in the dark about the children's act yesterday, but he saw right through it. It was obvious to him that they merely wanted to create an opportunity for him and Roxanne to interact. Although Estella was puzzled about that instruction, she still agreed obediently. At the side, Roxanne's nerves stretched tautly, and she eyed the man in front of her warily. If he wants to continue speaking of the topic yesterday, I really don't know how I should respond. Her thoughts were clearly written on her face. A glimpse of her expression had Lucian's gaze dimming, but he ultimately didn't put his emotions on display, merely stating, I discovered something. Come and have a look. Seemingly without thinking about it, Roxanne got the message that his so-called discovery had to do with the bacteria. At that realization, she put her wariness away. Nodding solemnly, she followed behind him. Have you and the kids been here? Lucian came to a stop under a gigantic tree. Stopping with him, Roxanne looked around before shaking her head. No. That tree was located at the edge of the woods. Yesterday, she had been with Archie, Benny, and Estella in the woods or by the waterfall. As such, they indeed hadn't been to that particular spot. Nodding in understanding, Lucian motioned for her to take a look at the bottom of the tree. Roxanne followed his gaze and took a closer look, upon which she made out a vague footprint. From the looks of it, it obviously belonged to an adult. As the footprints moved toward the edge of the grassy area, they grew increasingly faint. Therefore, she had no way of knowing whether the owner of those footprints had gone anywhere near the tent. However, it was certain that someone else was there yesterday other than her and the children. In fact, that person had been watching from the side while she was playing with the children. That realization had a wave of fear washing over Roxanne. Someone is following you guys. That aside, the person is very experienced, Lucian concluded. After all, it was clear as day that the footprint was left when someone jumped down from the tree. Who exactly would go to such lengths to stalk her? He really couldn't come up with an answer, so he asked directly, who do you think would want to keep tabs on you guys? Frowning, Roxanne shook her head. I can't think of anyone I've offended recently. If I've got to name someone, he's probably the only person. Besides, it was over business matters to boot. But it obviously can't be him who did such a thing. Apart from him. Out of the blue, a conjecture flashed across her mind. She reflexively lifted her eyes and glanced at the man before her, for the answer in her mind was inextricably linked to him. What? You've got the answer? Lucian's gaze had been fixated on her face, so he naturally didn't miss her eyes on him. Roxanne was slightly stunned, but in the end, she suppressed the suspicion she harbored and shook her head calmly. No. Before having any definite evidence, she didn't want to accuse anyone blindly. Lucian leveled a hard stare at her in an attempt to glean something from her countenance. Judging from her expression earlier, she has clearly thought of something. But for some unknown reason, she didn't give voice to it. Roxanne could almost sense his tangible gaze on her face. She lowered her eyes in feigned calmness to avoid his stare. We should go back. The kids are all starving. Since she wasn't planning on saying anything, Lucian didn't bother pressing the issue. He merely nodded non-committally. Roxanne furtively breathed a sigh of relief and followed behind him, heading toward the direction of the tent. Before that person is found, I'll arrange for some men to protect you and the kids, Lucian stated on the way back. Hearing that, Roxanne frowned, and she instinctively wanted to decline. Verily, she didn't want someone keeping tabs on her. But on second thought, having bodyguards keeping tabs on me in the open is far better than being secretly watched by the person yesterday. With that in mind, Roxanne ultimately relented. Thank you. You've also got to pay more attention to your surroundings during this time. If you discover anything out of place, contact me immediately, Lucian ordered. Roxanne agreed to them all. When they returned to the tent, the children weren't playing but sitting in a row, gazing in the direction where they had left. At the sight of the couple, their eyes lit up, and they trotted up to them. Roxanne and Lucian packed the tent before putting away all the camping equipment with Archie, Benny, and Estella. Then, they all made the trip back by taking Lucian's car. They left Roxanne's car at the camping site, having hired a garage to tow it away. When they arrived at Roxanne's house, Roxanne alighted from the car with Archie and Benny. Getting out of the car as well, Lucian helped them to retrieve their things from the trunk. After taking everything, Roxanne bid Lucian and Estella farewell, planning to bring Archie and Benny back into the house. Miss Jarvis. Making for a petite figure beside Lucian, Estella reached out and grabbed the hem of Roxanne's shirt. After being with Roxanne, Archie, and Benny for a day and a night, she couldn't bear to part with them just like that. Her voice melted Roxanne's heart. Roxanne dipped her eyes and stroked her head. Are you hungry, Essie? Come in and have some food. As her stomach has been grumbling since she woke up early in the morning, she must be famished now. Estella's eyes lit up, and she joyfully leaned close to Roxanne. Subsequently, Roxanne lifted her eyes and looked at the man in front of her. Would you like to eat something together, Mr. Farwell? Although she didn't know how to face Lucian, it was undeniable that he had helped them tremendously. Thus, she had no reason to give him the boot. She initially thought that he would agree readily, considering his temperament. Unexpectedly, Lucian didn't reply to her invitation instantly. Instead, his brows knitted together. After waiting for some time, Roxanne couldn't help finding it strange. From his reaction, my invitation seemed to have blindsided him. Let's have breakfast before leaving, Daddy. Estella seconded in a juvenile voice. Archie and Benny likewise clamored enthusiastically, Eat with us, Mr. Farwell. Only then did Lucian decline in a deep voice, No, thanks. I still got some matters to handle. I dismissed the meeting yesterday halfway, so I've got to go back and finish the meeting. Additionally, I've got to spend time ferreting out the culprit who made a move against the kids. At once, his demurral had the children's faces fall in disappointment. Roxanne patted Archie and Benny on their heads in consolation. When her eyes alighted on Estella, she appeared to waver slightly. What should I do about Essie when Lucian wants to leave immediately? Just when she planned on offering to drive Estella back later, Lucian's voice drifted into the air once more. Do you mind having Essie stay at your place for 2 days, Miss Jarvis? Upon hearing that, Roxanne and the 3 children were all taken aback. Ever since Lucian took Estella away from Roxanne's house, Estella never stayed over anymore, either because Roxanne had some concerns or Lucian forbade it. Several times, Roxanne relented due to Estella's tears, yet Lucian never did. For that reason, they never expected the man to voluntarily suggest it this time. Even Estella couldn't quite believe her ears. She gingerly tugged on the hem of her father's shirt. Can I really stay at Miss Jarvis' house, Daddy? Lowering his eyes and meeting her gaze, Lucian nodded impassively. Thereafter, he raised his eyes to Roxanne, who had yet to gather her wits about her, and elaborated. I'm not sure whether she had healed completely. I think I'll rest easier to entrust her to you. Still, Roxanne was hesitant to agree to it. But she feared that the person yesterday meant to target her, and Estella would be dragged into the mess again. Nevertheless, Lucian interrupted her with a frown. I'll send some men to keep an eye on things. If there's anything unusual, my men will contact me post-haste. In other words, he was telling her not to worry. At the side, Estella had her head lifted and gazed at Roxanne, looking hopeful. Roxanne's gaze flickered. Only after obtaining Lucian's promise did she forcibly suppress the worry within her. I got it. I'll take good care of Essie for the next few days. Lucian indifferently inclined his head a fraction in acknowledgement. Shortly after, he took his leave and left. Roxanne watched as his car disappeared into the distance before bringing Archie, Benny, and Estella into the mansion. All 3 children were already starving to the point that their stomachs growled incessantly. Without tarrying, Roxanne prepared some quick and easy breakfast to fill their stomachs first. After having breakfast, she had the children play by themselves while she stood up and went into the study. She simply couldn't sit back and do nothing about the person who used the bacteria on the children. Worse still, Lucian left Estella at her place. Hence, she wanted to catch the culprit as soon as possible to eliminate the potential dangers around the children. As far as she knew, Not every research institute was capable of manufacturing that bacteria. In the whole of Horrington, only a handful of research institutes possessed that capability. Therefore, she only needed to focus on investigating those few research institutes. At that thought, she made calls to the researchers she was acquainted with to inquire about the amount of that bacteria their research institutes had developed recently and their uses. Throughout it all, she researched some information on the internet. She made several calls in a row, but all the answers she received matched. That was to say, their bacteria hadn't been taken out of the research institute. Roxanne's gaze fell on the remaining few research institutes. She hadn't any acquaintances in those few research institutes, so it would take her some effort to investigate them. While she was contemplating how she should do that, the doorbell suddenly rang downstairs. With her thoughts interrupted, she could only get to her feet and go downstairs to open the door. Madeline stood at the door, looking haggard. When Roxanne opened the door, she promptly put away the weariness on her face. With a frown marring her countenance, she scrutinized Roxanne and the children. Aunt Madeline. Archie and Benny hadn't seen her in a long time. Now that she was visiting, they swiftly threw themselves at her affectionately. Gathering them into her embrace without batting an eyelash, Madeline checked them over carefully. It wasn't until she had ascertained that they were fine that she finally relaxed. "Why did you come over out of the blue?" Roxanne inquired in puzzlement. "If I remember correctly, she worked overtime yesterday. She should be catching up on sleep at this hour." Madeline straightened to her full height. "You know why. Your call yesterday was abrupt, and you didn't come home for the entire night. I was worried that something had happened to you and the boys, resulting in a fitful sleep all night. When she had finished working overtime yesterday, she specially came over to look in on them. However, Roxanne and the boys were still not home, though it was already past 9 o'clock at night. Mulling over it, she simply couldn't shake off the anxiety within her. She tried calling Roxanne, but the latter didn't pick up. Unfortunately, she had no idea where they had gone camping either. Consequently, she was so worried that she almost hadn't slept the whole night. Only when the sky started brightening did she barely catch 2 or 3 hours of sleep. As soon as she woke up, she came over to check on the situation again. Fortunately, someone opened the door this time. From the look of things, Roxanne and the children hadn't suffered any injuries. Clocking her best friend's sheer worry, Roxanne wore an apologetic expression. "My phone ran out of battery last night and automatically shut down." At that, Madeline sighed in exasperation. "What is important is that you're all fine." After saying that, she eyed Roxanne dubiously. Speaking of that, why did you suddenly spend the night outside? Didn't you say it was a one-day trip, so you'd be back in the evening?" Hearing that question from Madeline, Roxanne heaved a sigh. "It's a long story." Madeline went into the living room with the children and replied unceremoniously, "Tell me everything slowly, then. Before you do so, get me something to eat." She had come over right after getting out of bed and hadn't had the time to eat anything, so she was famished. Roxanne proceeded to take out the extra sandwiches she had made a while ago for her best friend to satiate her hunger. As Madeline ate, Roxanne narrated the experience they had yesterday. The instant Madeline heard that the children suffered from a bacterial infection yesterday, the sandwich in her mouth abruptly tasted like ashes. Who exactly dared to make a move against my godsons? The culprit even inflicted such agony on them. At the thought of the torment Archie and Benny had been through yesterday, she hugged the boys sitting beside her, her heart clenching painfully. Knowing that their godmother was concerned about them, Archie and Benny considerately coaxed, "Don't worry, Aunt Madeline. We're fine now." While saying that, they jumped up and down actively as though to prove they were in the pink of health. At the side, Estella was still unfamiliar with Madeline and stood beside Roxanne timidly. Before she knew it, she had also been pulled into Madeline's arms by the woman herself. For how dastardly of the culprit to make a move against such a cutie pie. Madeline griped, heartbroken. Although she's Lucian's daughter, her countenance makes everyone fall in love with her. The thought of someone inflicting pain on Estella had her gripped by the urge to ferret the culprit out and rip the person into shreds. Never having expected her best friend to be even more enraged than she was, Roxanne was dumbfounded for a moment. When Madeline had enough of hugging Estella, she reluctantly dropped her hands from around the little girl. She lifted her eyes at Roxanne. Whose doing was it? Are there any leads? Roxanne bobbed her head before shaking it in the next heartbeat. Madeline was entirely bewildered. There are some clues, but I haven't found anything useful. Having no plans on keeping her in the dark, Roxanne briefly told her everything she had done earlier. Without an ounce of hesitation, Madeline declared, "I'll help you out with that. I've made the acquaintance of a number of people in Chronicles in the past years." It went without saying that Roxanne took her up on it. She left some orders for the children before bringing Madeline upstairs with her. They went straight to the study. Seeing the 4 remaining research institutes on her list, Madeline quirked a brow. "I've collaborated with these few research institutes." In other words, she could help inquire about the matter. Roxanne's eyes lit up. Madeline didn't even need further instructions, shooting to her feet directly and going to the side to make the calls. She made 3 calls consecutively, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. Judging from her tone on the phone, Roxanne could more or less postulate the results. Right then, only the last research institute remained. Pinning all their hopes on it, Madeline made the call. Really? When did it go missing?" She cut to the chase after some pleasantries and asked about the bacteria. In no time, she received an answer from the other end of the phone. Their research institute indeed researched that kind of bacteria, and some even went missing before. The moment Roxanne heard Madeline's words, her eyes gleamed. Frowning, she shifted her gaze in the latter's direction. Madeline's expression was somber, and she was still pressing for details. Sensing Roxanne's gaze, she turned around and walked back over to her, putting the call on loudspeaker. The voice on the other end of the phone promptly drifted into Roxanne's ears. It's quite a complicated process to manufacture such a bacterium. Besides, it involves an astronomical cost and a great degree of difficulty. For that reason, we attach substantial importance to it. Half a month ago, we developed a new batch after much effort, planning to use it for research. Alas, part of it went missing.
Thank you for listening. If you have enjoyed this story, please like and share so others can see it too. Also hit the subscription button and notification bell so you can be notified on our next release. Thank you for your support. God bless you.